Well, hi folks, it is Dr. Joel Hunter here, and I'm broadcasting to you today a little bit closer up, kind of crazy with my big head here, but I wanted to have the slides up here because we're going to do an autopsy of your last quiz, the quiz that was on natural law theory, and I wanted to do some slides with you in order to go through those things effectively. Well, I'm going to do that at the end of the broadcast today. What I want to do first of all is simply talk to you about the reading you have for this week and what to expect then going forward on your mini project. So let's get started with that, I guess. So if you are in the class, all right, if you are in the class, yes, if you would send some hearts in for me so I can get an idea of how many of you here are associated with the class. So yeah, double tap the screen and let me see how many of the folks tuned in here are in. Okay, great, good. And yes, okay, good. So I'm counting about 6 of you so far. So that's great. And if you would also, if you have any questions as we go through any of the material for Egoism, which is going to be your stuff for this week, or if you have questions about the mini group project, then and also when we do the autopsy of quiz 4 on natural law theory, if you have any questions about anything as I go through those slides, fire away those questions because I do see them. I do not have a mirror today. This is great. I can actually read them, and I'm using a slightly larger screen for myself so I can see from a slight distance. So this is good. So what we'll do is with your questions, if you would, when you have a question, just lead with 2 question marks and capitalize your name and then write your question. And there may be a little delay between the time you actually get it typed up and when I see it. But when I do see it scroll by, I will make a point to stop and address the question. Okay, so with that, let's get started on the material today. And I don't have too much to say about your 2 chapters of reading in Fundamentals of Ethics. They go together really, really well in that you have, first of all, a descriptive theory, a psychological theory about egoism. So it's called psychological egoism. Now this is just to lay the groundwork for the next chapter, which is on ethical egoism. Now that's a normative theory. That it says what we ought to do. It lays out norms of behavior and standards of conduct. And so that is, properly speaking, the subject matter that you need to understand, ethical egoism. But in order to properly understand ethical egoism, it's helpful to know psychological egoism, the previous chapter. Now, your author makes a point that in order to be an ethical egoist, you don't necessarily have to subscribe to psychological egoism. They are detachable from each other. And one reason for that is because you have to add a moral principle in order to get a normative theory, an ethical theory like ethical egoism. And so that it doesn't require necessarily that you subscribe to psychological egoism, although many ethical egoists do. And I think you'll see why when you do that reading. Okay, so let me just touch on a couple things to really underscore what you need to understand about these 2 chapters. Okay, so number 1 is in psychological egoism, the main thing to understand is that it does not allow for genuine altruism. So anybody who would describe a behavior as altruistic, and in your reading, there's a description of the soldier who throws himself on a grenade in order to save his company. They're in, I think it was a tank or some kind of vehicle, but he saved their lives by giving his own life. Now that's the sort of action that most people would say is motivated by regard for others, direct regard for others, that there really is no self-interest in doing that. And that is, for example, the kind of behavior then that the psychological egoist has to give an account for in order to say that altruism does not really exist. Okay? So you can think of lots of altruistic behaviors, and the key is the key to psychological egoism and to why it rejects altruism is to understand that it is a theory about motivation. So it's psychology, it's psychological theory, okay? So it purports to describe the basis for all of our motivations when it comes to acting in ways that we can evaluate as ethical or not. So that's the main thing to take away from the first chapter that you're reading for this week, is that psychological egoism on the one hand and altruism are completely at odds. They are incompatible. You cannot subscribe to genuine altruism and subscribe to psychological egoism. So what your author does is try to present psychological egoism in such a way that they can explain, in terms of self-interest, all of those kinds of behaviors that we could think of that would be regarded by most people as altruistic. Okay, so again, really key here is psychological egoism says that all behaviors, all of our actions are motivated by self-interest. Okay, so we're always looking out for number one. We're always acting in such a way that we're trying to maximize our own welfare. That's egoism, okay? Now, so they have to come up with some way to explain how it is that it seems like lots of behaviors that humans all over the world do have to look like they are regarding other people, putting other people ahead of themselves. That's altruism. How do you do that? Well, what you have to argue is that that isn't real, that altruism has some other explanation that comes back to self-interest. Okay, so that's really the content of that chapter on psychological egoism. I'm seeing some hearts, so I'm thinking, yeah, this is registering. Okay, so the challenging part of the reading then is trying to figure out how plausible psychological egoism is, what its problems are that it has to solve, and then your author, gives you reasons why a lot of people do not find it plausible. Okay, cool. So then into this next chapter is ethical egoism. And ethical egoism, again, it does not require that you subscribe to psychological egoism, although they do work well together. One provides a factual basis, and then ethical egoism provides then a general moral principle, which is, okay, so if we know that, or if we say that all of our behaviors are motivated by our own self-interest and we're trying to maximize our welfare, then what we should do, what we ought to do, then is act in such a way that we are always trying to maximize our welfare. Okay, so it adds the ought, it adds the should. It tells you what one ought to do. Norms, this is a normative theory. So it's describing or prescribing norms of behavior, which are always going to be then grounded in self-interest. Okay, that's all that's going on in that chapter. And then he provides 3 arguments for ethical egoism and looks at the flaws in those arguments, and then concludes with, what are some seemingly intractable objections to this? Intractable meaning it's going to be really hard to overcome them. Excuse me. Okay, so that's your reading assignment for this week, and your quiz will be on those 2 chapters. Let's see if I can remember what the breakdown is off the top of my head. I think what I did is I put about 8. Did I do 8? Let's call it 50-50. It's either 8, 10, or 12 questions from psychological egoism, and then the remainder are from ethical egoism. Okay, so that's checkpoint number 1. Next then is our group project. Okay, so I was looking through your submissions, and there's a couple things to point out. Okay, first of all, some of you haven't actually done it through the collaboration, Canvas collaborations in your group. Some of you did it as a collaboration within the whole class. Okay, and so what I've asked you to do is to make sure that you move those documents over to your group. So create a collaboration within your group and then just copy and paste what you did for the class there. So, and that the reason for that is to help out your group members, your fellow peers, because they need to be able to find what you've done for your evidence and your thesis and your paragraph within the group itself. Okay, so make sure that you move that stuff over. Yeah, so this week you have, the only thing that you have to do on this project, is you need to do the review of your peer review of your group members' paragraph modules. So that's module 3. We're all done with the modules after this week. So make sure that your paragraph module is up, first of all, and then second of all, go in and look at your group members' paragraph modules and provide the comments as I instructed you in the handout. So that's taking the 3 questions that focus on the thesis. Now the thesis is expanded throughout the paragraph. Okay, in the previous module, your thesis statement, the argument was minimal. It was minimized to just a couple sentences. In your paragraph, you've expanded it through the whole paragraph, but you still want to focus on the thesis, the quality of the thesis. And so there's those 3 questions that I need you to answer, and that will provide good feedback for then your peers in your group. Okay, so next thing is I want to go through the last quiz. I'm going to do something a little different this time. It's an autopsy of the last quiz you took, so that's quiz 4, and that was on natural law theory. Okay, before I get started into that, I'm going to go ahead and do my slides here. So before I get started into that, I want to just pause for a second and see if there are any questions on what you need to do this week, either with the reading or with the mini project assignment. Any questions so far? While you all are thinking about that, I've just mentioned that what I'll be doing, not this week, but next week, is I will be providing you feedback on your paragraphs for your group project, so that any additional commentary that I think would help you go from what you've done so far in the 3-step modules to the final product, which is due October 12th, so you still have, I think, 3 weeks or so. Next week, I'll be adding any additional feedback of my own to help you, take it from the rough draft stage of the paragraph module into the final product. Okay, so, all right, so I'm not seeing any questions so far, so let's move on to the autopsy. This is going to be different and fun, and I'm not sure, I'm going to be kind of down here in the corner doing my thing because I'm going to be looking at my copy of the quiz as well as the book to try to give you some guidance. Now, if you have your book nearby, grab a hold of it and get ready to go, because I'm going to point out page numbers that you find some of the answers on. So I'll be doing that. Now, it'll be on the slides, so you can always refer to it there. You can catch it on the replay, when you have your book in front of you, if you don't have it now. And also, I'll upload this as a PDF that you can review in the Canvas. Okay, so here we go. Let's see what this looks like. So I just want to make a couple comments. One comment, really, at the beginning. And that is, there are basically 2 types of quiz questions that I ask. There are ones that can be answered or are answered explicitly in the text. Now, they may not be exactly verbatim as the author says it, but they're often very close, if not verbatim. So questions that are available to be answered explicitly from the text, they're taken directly from the text, both, or usually the answer choices and the question itself. You can find those. Those are typically the easier questions. The more difficult and challenging questions are the ones that I'm calling inference questions. So that's where you have to take your grasp of the main points in the text and then be able to apply that knowledge and draw correct inferences on the basis of questions that I pose that aren't drawn explicitly from the text, but they are answerable with the knowledge you get from the text. Okay, and so the way this breaks down in your quiz is you have 14 explicit questions and 6 inference questions. Excuse me. So one curious thing is, now you would think that, wow, okay, so the average was about 10 points lower on this quiz than I would have liked. And as I was looking through the questions that were giving people the most problem, you know what I was expecting? I was expecting those inference questions to be the ones, but they weren't. They were only half of the ones that were most frequently missed. So that tells me something. That tells me that those of you who struggled to get, in a C range on this quiz, are probably not doing the close reading, okay? And you may be doing the reading, but you're not doing it studiously. You're not pausing over the key claims, the key terms, and making sure that you understand those before you move on. And then how the arguments are constructed, and then how he evaluates those arguments for their strengths and weaknesses. That kind of work, that kind of close, studious reading is really essential, and it should enable you to get all of the explicit questions completely correct. And it should empower you to be able to do all of the inference questions correctly too. But notice that if you did all the explicit questions, you basically would get a C. So if you got less than a C on this quiz, and I'm saying C, 72, 75, something like that, then that's the thing you should ask yourself is, maybe I'm not reading this closely. Maybe you need to read the assignment more than once in order to read it closely. That's pretty common, actually, for this kind of text, for the difficulty level of this text. So take that as a suggestion for how you proceed and improve on your quiz grades. And now let's get to the actual quiz itself. All right, so hopefully you can read this. This is going to be question number 2, which says, natural law theory is attractive because it promises to explain which difficult problems in ethics. Okay, now this is an example of an explicit question that only 64% of people got right. The answers to this, the answer choices here, you have to select the ones that apply and reject ones that do not. And all of them apply except the last one. The how and why morality is relative is not mentioned and is not actually appropriate for natural law theory. Natural law theory does not regard and has no truck with the idea that morality is relative. And so if you look on pages 77 through 78, you will see the first 4 listed. And so those are the ones that are the correct answers for this question. Okay, next question is question 5. And this is one of those inference questions now, because what I've done is I've constructed an argument for you, and I've asked you to evaluate this argument. Now, this is an argument that is put together by your author. Now, he does not do it in the minimal form that I've given you here. He has it as a paragraph. Okay, but what I've done is distill the 5 points of the argument as separate claims so that you can see how it works out. So if you go to the top of page 84, so let me just put that. Go to the top of page 84, you will see the paragraph where this argument appears. And here's the key point, and this is where a second problem, besides close reading of your reading assignment, might be an issue. The other issue might be how carefully you're reading the quiz question itself. Okay, so if you look at this quiz question, it says, according to the author, an argument like this is why there are no agnostics or atheists who are also natural law theorists. Okay, this is false because it is, he makes a clear point that, in fact, there are non-theists, agnostics, atheists, who are natural law theorists. And not all natural law theorists are theists. He says this in a couple different ways, actually. So this one is almost explicit, but I'm calling it an inference because you have to be able to draw this conclusion that it's false on the basis of having read the author carefully. Okay, so if this were true, which many of you, let's see, 60% of you said this was true. If this were true, then your author would have had to have said something like, all natural law theorists are theists. And they're not. And he says so explicitly. Okay, so there's an example that I'm guessing on this one came down to having not read the question carefully. All right, so do be sure you have plenty of time. I think, and looking at the completion time on the quizzes, and they're all at about, or the average is about 20 minutes or so. That's an extra 10 minutes. So do take your time to read these kinds of questions carefully, especially ones where I'm constructing an argument for you. All right, let's go to the next. Question number next is 6. Okay, you are taking a philosophy quiz is an example of what kind of truth? Okay, so many of you answered conceptual here. And this was interesting to me. If you look on page 78, look at the examples that he gives you of empirical truths. And there's one that's very close to this one that I gave you. You were taking a philosophy quiz. So how do you know that that's true or false? You know it's true or false on the basis of sense experience. By using your eyes, you know you're taking a quiz. By using your fingers, touch, you know that you're taking a quiz. That's how you know. That's empirical. It's experiential. And so that is the kind of truth that the claim you are taking a philosophy quiz is. It's empirical. Okay. So that one was technically an inference because you had to be able to look at a new kind of claim, not something that was taken directly from the text, but there are examples that are similar to it. And so you have to infer from those examples that, oh, okay, this is an empirical claim. Or you have to figure out, well, how would I know if this is true or false? Well, I would know how, because the very meaning of the terms makes them true. That's a conceptual truth. Or is it on the basis of sense experience? So it's the second. All right, number next is, excuse me again, is question number 8. This was an interesting one. Only 36% of you got this one right, and that kind of mystified me too. Although, if you were struggling with the definition or the meaning of empirical and conceptual truths, I can kind of understand why many of you would answer neither conceptual nor empirical. And there's also, there's a slight, it's not a trick necessarily, but there's an easy way to fall into a trap here because of how your text is worded. But the key to getting this one right is that opening phrase, according to natural law theory. Now, this is not according to your author, who does claim with Hume that moral truths are neither empirical or conceptual, or at least he's reporting that as Hume's position and sort of the standard position of philosophers. But if you look at the phrasing of the question, it's quite clear. It says, according to natural law theory. Okay, and that's who argues that moral truths, like it is wrong to engage, or moral claims I should say, like it is wrong to engage in the recreational slaughter of another human being, is not a, it is actually an empirical truth. If true, it is an empirical truth. It's something that we can know by studying the nature of human beings. And we would do that through things like the efficiency model or the fitness model or things like that, where we would ascribe goodness and badness to behaviors on the basis of those kinds of terms that can be empirically tested. Okay, that is clearly discussed in the text there. And yeah, so if you look about 2/3 of the way down the page, on page 79, you will see this discussed. Okay, next. We are going on to question 12. Oh my gosh. What happened on question 12? Okay, I'm going to take part of the blame for this because I wrote this argument out and I was a little bit careless with claim number 1, premise 1, which says, since humans are animals, it is in our nature to behave as other animals do. And many of you who did not choose premise 2, you chose that one. And what I did is I adjusted those of you who answered that the first premise was wrong. I adjusted your quiz grade to give you credit for that because the way I've worded it, it's a little too ambiguous. It needs to be actually a longer premise in order to be plausible, or to be less implausible. Let's put it that way. So, yes. So I'm just going to leave that aside. That if you answered 1 on this one because 1 is false, okay, I'll give you credit for it. But the best answer still is premise 2. Premise 2 is fallacious. It's false. And if you look at it, you'll see why. Let me just make this little notification go away. You'll see why. It claims that animal behavior, because it is natural, is morally acceptable. Natural law theorists do not agree with that. If you read the Philippa Foot article, then you know that that's not the case. Just because some animals kill and eat their young, which they do, some do, not all, but some do, just because we can look at that as an example of animal behavior, we cannot ascribe that it's morally okay to do the same thing that an animal does. We don't just do animal behaviors. But that's not a good argument because premise 2 is false. Okay, so this was a tricky one, and the answer is on page 80 through 81. It's both an explicit, because that claim number 2 is explicitly rejected by your author in that section there. But it's also an inference kind of problem because it requires you to apply then your understanding of natural law theory from the reading to come up with the right answer here, or the best answer, I should say, not the right answer, the best answer, because really 1 is an acceptable answer given the imprecision in the way I expressed it. Okay, so I really like that question too, and I was so sad to see only 12% of you answered because premise 2 is false. All right, number next. Right, question 15, I think this is. Is that right? Yeah. So natural law theorists who argue that human nature is whatever our natural function or purpose is, may identify those purposes in terms of, and then you are to select all that apply. So this is found on pages 83 through 85. And again, the one that does not fit here is the last one. And this should be, this one should have, this is actually explicit, that the natural law theorists don't give they don't care at all what the norms of society are, because those are this conventional morality. That is something that just because human societies create laws and forbid behaviors and approve of certain behaviors, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's that those are arising from nature. In fact, we might create social norms that are against nature, that are harmful to ourselves. That's according to natural law theory, right? Okay, so look on pages 83 through 85 for the correct answer there. Now let me see. I think I got, yeah, a couple more that I just want to do with you, and then we'll be done. So question 16 is, this too is also interesting. A lot of you missed this one. And here's another one that I think can be attributed to a less careful reading of the question. Okay, so let's look at this. The natural law argument and the argument from humanity show that definitions are useless for gaining clarity about the subject matter of morality. Okay, so a lot of you said, that's true. That's exactly what the author said. But he didn't. What he said was that on page 89, if you look at the second paragraph before the conclusion, you will see where your author says that, hey, guess what? Definitions are really useful for helping us clarify terminology and for clarifying terms. Definitions are super important for that very thing, the thing that I've outlined there in the box. So the arguments that are mentioned there do not show that definitions are useless for gaining clarity. What they do show, and this is probably what you assumed, or that you overlooked by overlooking help us gain clarity, is that they are useless for helping us settle moral controversies. They are useless for helping us solve moral problems. Yes, that is true, but that's not what the question asks you. So I think this one is really a result of just a little less care in reading. So do make sure that you read the questions closely. All right, and then the last one, I'm just going to do one from the Philippa Foot reading. I think I made a mistake with you last week when I said, hey, I was kind of like, Philippa Foot, it's hard, it's real philosophy, like contemporary philosophy, it's hard. Lots of terms, Aristotelian categorials. What in the world is that? And I think I overplayed that because there were just too many people who didn't seem to read this at all, or at least just really skimmed it and didn't get the basics of that article, which I did ask you to do. So let me just go through this one question with you, and then we'll be done. So question 18. According to Foot's definition, the goodness predicated of a hive constructed by a colony of bees is an example of what? And many of you put natural goodness. So that is about 80% of you said natural goodness. But the answer is secondary goodness. And if you go to page 67, you'll see some examples of that, where she explicitly gives you that we ascribe goodness to things like a beaver's dam, that, hey, that's a good dam. Not on the basis of natural goodness. In other words, the things that are intrinsic to the species, but what she calls this other category of goodness. The same kind of goodness that we would ascribe to, like, nice weather, for skiing or something like that. We would say is good weather. Well, a good hive, then, would be an example of secondary goodness, not natural goodness. It's a little bit tricky because we think of a hive or we think of a beaver's dam as a natural product, which it is. But the goodness that is ascribed to it, according to Foot, isn't properly called natural goodness. She wants to reserve the term natural goodness for a narrower category of behaviors that then can be applied to humans. Anyway, so that's an example, just one from the Philippa Foot reading. Well, all right, so that was a long autopsy, and I hope that that is helpful. And what I'll probably do next week with you as I help you prepare for your exam is something similar, in going through all of your past quizzes, and I'll probably pull out some examples of the toughest questions. And I guess to sort of parting words are, as you complete this week's assignments and as you start to prepare for the first exam, what I would encourage you to do is look back at those questions that you missed, because you will probably see some version of those questions that were missed on the upcoming exam. And like I said, next week I want to do a fuller explanation of what's going to be on the exam with you, as well as maybe some more of these autopsy type questions from your previous quizzes, and hopefully you'll find that helpful. Okay, I am done with Intro to Ethics for this week. Oh my gosh, this was so much stuff. Do you have any questions? Thanks for doing it. It helps. Yes, you're welcome. Corinna, yes, you're very welcome. I'm glad. It's having Periscope is so experimental for me. Old dog, new tricks kind of thing, because I'm realizing as we go through the semester, hey, what if we did this? I think this could be helpful. And so, yeah, I think this might be something that I would regularly do, maybe from here on out. Any other questions? Of course, no, you all are going to get 90s and 100s on the quizzes from here on out, so why would we do that? Right? Okay, any other questions? Any questions? No. Okay, here's what we're going to do then. I'm going to say goodbye for this week, and I will see you next week when we talk about your first exam. And thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you later.